Travis Wayne Goodsell, while uploading a Latter-day Prophecy Sign in Heaven event that is to occur next Friday, which, again, using science, and if nothing happens, then we have to go back, re-examine it, redevelop a theory to have tested to figure out the anomaly. But I got the idea to do a video for Restoring Joseph Smith's Church of Christ, having to do with restoring the translation of the Bible. And there are creationists who believe that the Bible is literally true and is historically accurate. And so science is wrong and need to correct their information to conform to their interpretation of the Bible and its chronology. I don't think they even understand James Ussher, from the 17th century, developed the chronology that creationists now believe in. Isn't that interesting? A man who just said Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC is the first day in Genesis. And as a result, many problems, violence, anger have ensued. On my other channels, I went over how Wednesday we had the Roman Catholic Church's Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And it's not 17 days before Christmas, the birth of Jesus. No, the birth of Jesus in the Roman Catholic Church is 8 September. And yet it's being celebrated for Christmas. There's confusion there. Well, you got to know the origin of who caused it. Constantine created Christmas for the birthday, and then the Roman Catholic Church, when putting in the book of Revelation into the New Testament, had a dilemma because there were those who didn't want Revelation in the New Testament. And in chapter 12, there's a star date given for 23rd September 2017. And they can't have that, so they can't make that the date for September. So the Immaculate Conception is during the time when it is transformed. It actually is a linguistic tell, because during the Roman period, where people think the Bible stories were literal history, the sun would be in Virgo during the August month. And now it's in September to October. So you can see that it's shifting. And so for September 8th to be designated reveals the linguistic tell of when they put the book of Revelation in and accepted it, and therefore acknowledged the dates, was because middle of August, the middle of September was understood as the time period. But I checked. This was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Once-in-an-earth-time event. It did not exist prior to. So it helps greatly to utilize science in what you do. Now, the Book of Mormon talks about the great and abominable church taking out the plain and precious parts of the Bible, causing a stumbling block, and we have Article of Faith number 8. We believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly. And we have Joseph Smith talking about how he is going to do parables in the Doctrine and Covenants, and he does a whole rewrite of section 124, saying it's now to be understood as 45, sorry. Doctrine and Covenants 45, where he's now taking Matthew 24 and turning it to be a prophecy for Mormons instead. And so we see Jews, we see Jerusalem Temple, we see Judah, and it's all supposed to be parable for Mormons. And it also is a clue for us that the Bible are stories prophesying of the latter days. They're not literal history. Joseph Smith also added scripture. He added stories. And if you're thinking that, well, that confirms it's literal history, you've missed what he was doing. Because even his own Joseph Smith history, 1838, isn't accurate history. What's going on? Again, prophecies for the latter days. And so when we go over the Bible, I'll give you some examples of how it is to be translated correctly, as I've already done it. There are prophecies that it's supposed to be translated correctly. Ezekiel 37, stick of Joseph, stick of Judah, combine together and become one. And it's not the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon tells us it's not, and tells us about that fulfillment at a future time for a different book, one that would be in Egyptian. And there's our clue. We need to go to the Egyptian stories to correct the translation stories mistranslated. So we start at the beginning, creation of heaven and earth. In Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 says that heaven and earth have human offspring. These are the generations of heaven and earth in the day they were created. And so, if you're unfamiliar with Jewish mysticism, Alphabet Ben Sira in 600 CE came out with a story of Adam and Lilith, supposedly his first wife. And the author is trying to clear up confusion as who's the first wife in chapter 1 versus the other one who's created later, and who eventually is called Eve. And Eve can't be found anywhere in ancient documents. It's like she was just made up by the author of the text. And yes, that is the case. And so, to understand where the Alphabet Ben Sira comes from and Genesis, you go to the Egyptian documents And there you have the Sun City, Heliopolis, creation glyph of Nut and Geb. And it is a story, but it is translatable in different ways. It's the creation of heaven and earth. It's the creation of the Nile Delta, thus Egypt, the flooding of the annual Nile. It has to do with star dates, because the dog star Sirius, which was understood as representing Horus for the Egyptians, as the three wise men of Orion's belt point to it. Orion was Osiris, his father, and the transition of authority from father to son, the birth of children, the firstborn birthright blessing son, and all of that is involved. Elements of a water completely immersing the land. The waters recede, dry land rises up, just like birth. My water is broke. We need to get to the hospital and pay thousands of dollars for what should be free. And so you can see they're teaching sex ed as well as teaching a whole bunch of things all at once with the Egyptian original stories. And so the Bible author, having lost a lot of that information, is recreating a history that did not happen. And so you can see how missing portions were taken out, and other mistranslations, as people want to focus on words and how they are to be translated rather than paying attention to the stories, which then would help you understand which words should be put in. And so we get to Genesis chapter 2, and scholars think that this is a completely different text and a different source origin, and once we find it, we'll prove it to you. It's already in the Egyptian documents. It's the same Heliopolis creation story with the descendants. See, because the one who lifts up the heavens, Nut, from Geb, earth, is the father, Shu. And if you understand the story, you'll understand why he's trying to separate them. And he was a little too late. She's already pregnant. And so then, when you're talking about the Egyptian calendar, then that's where the story continues on. But the Bible doesn't really get into a calendar system there for us. They leave that part out. Although there is something weird about Enoch and his city and being 365 years old when his Zion takes off into outer space. And so in chapter 2, Adam is formed from the dust of the earth. You have moisture that falls and makes clay of the dirt, and then after Adam is formed, the breath of life is breathed into him. And it's similar to babies when they're born. They burst out of the water, out of the womb, and take their first breath. But in the Egyptian story, Father Shu is the breath of life. He's air. And so separating the heaven from the earth is the air in between. Also called firmament, also called Rakia, also called Rakiyang by Joseph Smith because of his Hebrew teaching from Rabbi Sykes. In his wife, Shu's wife, is Tefnut. She's moisture. So she's the one that waters the earth. Father Shu breathes life into the formed earth, which is man. The parents, or Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, of Adam and Eve, as they are renamed differently. And so Lilith is completely removed from the text, even though that's Nut, the dark sky. Looks like the video is done. Let me get this out of the way for us. It's weird how YouTube is inconsistent with their treatment of videos. And if you haven't heard, because you only come to this channel, the church has destroyed me, and so I will not be eventually doing any more videos. This could be the last one for this channel. I have no idea. It's just a matter of when the official time is up. But yeah, they've destroyed me. So that was prophesied. Great and abominable church. Murder of the saints. And this channel was intended not to criticize the church, but when necessary in restoring Joseph Smith's Church of Christ, it's necessary to talk about those things. And so then we move on to the garden scene, and of course Heliopolis, the Sun City, is the Garden of Eden, and thus in Africa. And so when Joseph Smith says it's the United States of America, he's not talking literally. He's using metaphoric parable speech, and Mormons don't get it. And so then you have Bill Maher going on his show talking about the crazy beliefs of Mormons. So, well, if only somebody could step forward and restore Joseph Smith's original Church of Christ. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. But there's so much that needs to be restored. And so, the garden story, you have the serpent, and that's a sign in the heavens. It happened 2018, I think, or was it 19? I did the video on the other channels. I think depends on when it was. But we're experiencing it currently because in the heavens, Akrib is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so after you are weighed in the balances of Libra, your judgment is determined at that tree, that star, Akrib. And so you read over it, and you see that Lucifer, the serpent, is the one that convinces Adam and Eve that nudity is evil and a sin that they should be ashamed of and feel guilty about. And they don't get magic underwear. They get outer clothing, which is taken from the Egyptian carvings when they're all doing this. And so Nut and Geb are portrayed as naked when they're being separated by Shu. And so when you read in the Bible that Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed, that's what they're referring to. And so then the serpent comes along, and the serpent is Apophis or Apith, if I can pronounce it correctly. It's the serpent that is battled every night in the underworld as the sun sets. And so the promise of he shall have power to bruise your heel, but he shall have power to bruise thy head, whatever, crush thy head. And so that's what that is referring to, is the last day's battle with Horus, the son of Osiris, as Osiris is murdered. And so it's important to realize that the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants 29 verses 36 and 40 are correct when only Adam fell that man might be. Men are that they might have joy. Never Eve. And that is lost from Mormonism. It needs to be restored. But that's why. Is that the first Christ is murdered and the Son Christ needs to restore the kingdom. And so like Joseph was murdered, his organization, Church of Christ, usurped, given a different God and all different stuff, and thus needs to be restored by someone who comes out of the great and abominable church that murdered Joseph. And thus was portrayed anciently. So Joseph likewise knew this and gave the prophecies. And so then you get to having Cain and Abel, and what happens? Oh, yeah, Cain murders his brother Abel. And interestingly, instead of having Cain named Seth and Abel named Asher, Adam and Eve have a replacement son born whose name is Seth. That's Set, the brother of Osiris, who murdered Osiris, which is Asher in Hebrew. And so Noah comes through Seth rather than through Cain, because Cain gets banished from the kingdom, has to go eastward, and thus is believed to be Africa, and blah blah blah. No. He actually goes westward in the Egyptian story. But that's after Horus is born, raised, goes back to restore the throne, and wins the battle. And so Cain and Abel's story is kind of mixed up, as the garden story is now prophecy for what will happen, and then we get right into it. The murder of Osiris by his brother Seth. And Horus is now the Noah character, as Noah needs to build a boat. Well, you can see the pattern of that throughout Genesis and into the story of Moses, and then Joshua, and then Elijah, and Elishua. You have an ark, a boat, that is there floating on the waters, and this is the Ogdod story of the Egyptians, but it's a creation story, just like the Heliopolis creation story, because the earth is flooded, the waters recede, dry land emerges. And the ark is sort of parting the waters to land on top of the mountain. The Egyptians had pyramid mountains, and the capstone is at the top. That's the Messiah symbol. And the dry land appearing, the birthright blessing son, the firstborn. And the two eyes of Horus being the word for Peter, which is seer in Egyptian. And so Moses, they have him as a baby in the boat on the Nile River, and then becomes the son of Pharaoh and his wife, the queen, not the daughter, the queen. Daughters cannot raise kids by themselves. The house of Pharaoh, not the daughter of Pharaoh. That's where a word change does make all the difference when you understand the story. And then you have Moses in the Exodus. What happens? He's at the Reed Sea, which is the afterlife, the netherworld. And he parts the waters, walks through on dry land. Not muddy land, dry land. That's not a historical event. It did not happen. That's referring to this creation understanding, this creation story, and the latter days significance of it, the restoring of the throne of the good king who was murdered and his kingdom usurped. And then you have Noah now as the father figure, and then there's a little incident that occurs in the tent while Noah is drunk and naked, and Ham, which is Chem, for the masculine of Kemet, which is feminine, which means Egypt, and yet they still put in Mitzrayim for Egypt. That would be the daughter, and should be named Kemet. Egyptus is what Joseph Smith calls her in Abraham chapter 1, as well as the mother of Ham, or the mother of Egyptus, and the firstborn birthright blessing son who became Pharaoh and her sons. And so you have the genealogy given in Abraham, where Ham is married to Egyptus. Ham has Canaan and a daughter named Egyptus, and they have the first Pharaoh of Egypt. And that's how it would have been done for the Egyptians. But it also explains what happened in the tent, is that we're getting confused with all of that. You need to rewrite the story. Again, it's referring back to Nut and Geb, and the father having to separate them. And so Ham is the one who sees Noah naked, and so Noah then curses Ham's son Canaan? What's up with that? Well, that's wise. The story of the Heliopolis creation glyph of Shu separating his children Nut and Geb after the orders of Atum, who was the first man of all men on every earth. And Joseph knew what he was doing, just nobody gives him credit. And so, yeah, the brother and sister, Canaan and Egyptus, gave birth to the first Pharaoh, and thus they were cursed, because they were supposed to marry the other brother's children. And thus the Egyptians continue that pattern of marrying the sister because of that story. And so the Bible story just is uncomfortable, doesn't want to talk about it, and purposely makes it vague and confusing for people. But that's what it's referring to. It's the Heliopolis creation glyph, the story behind it. And so then you get Abraham, and there are two instances where Abraham goes before Pharaoh, or another king in tributary land of Pharaoh, in which Isaac also has some stuff like that. And Abraham says, "Tell them you're my sister." Well, that's why. The Egyptians, pharaohs, had to marry their sisters. And so Abraham is technically a pharaoh, and from Egypt. And so when you look at Abraham again from Joseph Smith, what do you know? That's exactly right. The Tower of Babel, that's the Egyptian pyramids, but they throw in mud brick, which is an anachronism because of the author who's writing it is throwing in a whole bunch of Semitic, Mesopotamian, Babylon stuff. And so it's actually Lebanon, not Babylon. And Beirut is where Babel was in Canaan. And that is connected to the Egyptian story of Osiris's first death, in which he was nailed in a coffin, sent upstream in the Nile into the Mediterranean, where it landed in Beirut, Lebanon. And then the cedar of Lebanon grew in its place. The king of Lebanon, or king of Babel, carved the tree into the Dej pillar of Osiris. And Isis returned his body to Egypt with missionaries gathering the body. And then, the rituals video that I did for you. And so when the latter-day Christ is referred to as the branch in the Old Testament stories, prophecies, prophets, that's what it's referring to, is that story, as well as the story of Horus winning the battle against his uncle Set. He gives him salad rather than porridge for Esau, and Set then gets pregnant from the salad and gives birth to a branch, which is Horus. And so Amun sees this and goes, "Oh, okay, Horus is the rightful king. Sorry, Set, you're banished." And that's how it works. And so when Ezekiel does the parable about a twig from the top branches of a cedar of Lebanon, that's what he's referring to there. That's the latter-day prophecy Christ. And he comes to America. That's the parable interpreted. And so many Jews have had that belief that their Christ would restore New Jerusalem in America. And the Smiths were a part of that with the New Israelites in restoring the history, where they believed they were the literal descendants of the Israelites, and thus the Christ would come through them. Mortal man, mortal baby. And that's how you would go about correcting the translation of the scriptures, is referring to the Egyptian stories. And you can see how the errors are readily apparent when you compare them with the Egyptian stories from which they originated. You can eliminate all the Babylonian influences with the seventh day of rest, because that was the bad luck day, as the Babylonians created the 7-day week calendar. That's why the Jews celebrate Sabbath on the 7th day of the week. It's from Babylon. They got assimilated. So there you go. Ezekiel 37 has been officially restored. And I can go over that for you because it even talks about David and the latter day. So 37. Okay. It's after it. Stick with Joseph, stick with Judah. Idols, there it is, verse 24. And so after the combining of the two books, and David my servant shall be king over them, and they all shall have one shepherd, they shall also walk in my judgments, and observe my statutes, and do them. That's the millennial reign of peace with the last days Christ, who's a descendant of David, restoring the kingdom of David, the 18th dynasty David Moses's, as I've gone over with you in that other video. So there you go. And there's Jacob, the usurper. They shall dwell in the land that I had given unto Jacob, the usurper, wherein your fathers have dwelt. Come out of the great and abominable church, the usurping church.